Hello, boys and girls. Welcome back to A Story for You. We're going to jump back to Curious George, and we're going to read Curious George Gets a Medal. And these stories are by H.A. Ray. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but always very curious. George was alone this morning, looking at a picture book, when the doorbell rang. And there's George. It was the mailman. "Here's a letter for you," he said. "Put it on your friend's desk. He'll read it to you when he comes home." George was curious. It was not often somebody wrote him. Too bad he could not read the letter, but maybe he could write one himself. In the top drawer of the desk there was paper and ink and a fountain pen. George sat down on the floor and began to write, but the pen was dry. There's the mailman and George getting his pen and paper. It needed ink. George would have to fill it. He found a funnel from the kitchen and started pouring ink. But instead of the ink going into the pen, the ink spilled all over the floor and made a big blue puddle. It was an awful mess. Read the whole page. Quickly, George got the blotter from the desk. That was no help. The puddle grew bigger all the time. George had to think of something else. Why, soap and water, that's what you clean up with. And from the kitchen shelf, he got a big box of soap powder and poured it all over the ink. Oops. Here's George with his mess. Uh-oh. Let's see what happens. Then he pulled the garden hose through the window, and he opened the tap and sprayed water on the powder. See the whole picture? I love the pictures of Curious George. They're so fun. Bubbles began to form, and then some lather, and more lather, and more lather, and more lather. Uh-oh. And in no time, the whole room was full of lather. So full, indeed, that George had to escape in a hurry. Can you see? There's George, quickly getting out the window. When he was safely out of the house, he first turned off the tap. But what next? How could he get rid of all the lather before his friend came home? George sat down on the grass and thought for a long time. Finally, he had an idea. He would get a big shovel and shovel the lather out of the window. But where was the lather? While George had been outside thinking, it had all turned into water. Now the room looked like a lake and the furniture like islands in it. Shovel was no use. A pump was what George needed to get the water out, and he knew just where to find one. He'd seen a portable pump at the farm down the road. The farmer was away working in the fields, and nobody noticed George when he got the pump out of the shed. It was heavy. He would need help to pull it all the way back to the house. There's George running to the farm. Maybe he could tie the goat to the pump and make her pull it. But just as George was about to slip the loop over the goat's head, he was hurled into the air and landed near a pen full of pigs. The biggest pig was standing near the gate. What if George could just open the gate enough to let him out? A big pig could easily pull the pump. Carefully, George lifted the latch, and before he knew it, all the pigs burst out of the pen, grunting and squealing and trying to get away as fast as they could. George was delighted. He had never seen anything like it. For the moment, all his troubles were forgotten, and now the pigs were all gone, and not a single of them was left to help him with the pump. Luckily, there were cows grazing nearby. Cows were gentle and strong. It would be nothing for a cow to pull the pump for him. This time, George was right. The cow did not mind being tied to the pump, and she even let George climb on her back, and off they went. George was glad. Now he would soon be home, pump out the room, and everything would be all right. Meanwhile, the farmer and his son had heard the squealing of the pigs. They rushed home from the fields, and now they had their hands full catching the pigs. Not until the last pig was safely back in the pen did they have time to look around. Excuse me? And what did they see? A little monkey riding off with their cow and making off with their pump. The chase was on. George and the cow were ahead at first, but the pump was slowing him down. The farmers were getting closer and closer, and when they'd almost caught up with him, but where was George? He was here, hiding in a shirt. The farmer had run past him, but on the way home he'd come back over the same road. George did not feel safe in his hiding place, and just then a truck came rattling down the road. George climbed aboard, monkeys are good at jumping, and was gone before the farmers had a chance to see him. The truck drove to the part of town that George had never seen before. At last it stopped in front of a large building. It was a museum. George did not know what a museum was. He was curious. While the guard was busy reading his paper, George slipped inside. He walked up the steps and into a room full of all sorts of animals. At first George was scared, but then he noticed that they did not move. They were not alive. They were stuffed animals. They were put into the museum so that everybody could get a good look at them. In the next room, George saw something so enormous that it took his breath away. It was a dinosaur. George was not scared this time. He knew it was not real. He looked at the dinosaur and then at the baby dinosaur, and then he saw a palm tree full of nuts. George liked nuts. Suddenly he felt very hungry. He had missed lunch that day. He would climb up, and just then he heard footsteps. He had to hide. But where? The The family came in to take a look at the dinosaur. They paid no attention to the little monkey who was standing there. The monkey did not move. He stood so still that they thought he was just another stuffed animal. George was glad when they were gone. Now he could pick the nuts. And he climbed up the dinosaur's neck and started to pull. But the nuts did not come off. George did not know that they were not real either. He pulled harder and harder, and the tree began to sway. Oh. Crash! Down came the tree on the dinosaur's head. Down came the dinosaur, and down came George. Guards came rushing from all sides, and underneath the fallen dinosaur, they found a little monkey. They pulled him out and brought him to Professor Wiseman, who was the director of the museum. Professor Wiseman was terribly angry. "Lock that naughty monkey up right away," he said, "and take him back to the zoo. He must have run away from there." George was carried off in a cage, and he felt so ashamed. And suddenly, the door opened. "George!" somebody shouted. It was his friend, the man with the yellow hat. "It seems that you've gotten yourself into a lot of trouble today," he said. "But maybe this letter will get you out of it. It's from Professor Wiseman. He needs your help for an experiment. I found it on my desk at home, but I couldn't find you anywhere, so I came over here to talk to the professor." And this is what the letter said. Museum of Science. Dear George, a small spaceship has been built on our experimental station, and it is too small for a man, but it could carry a little monkey. Would you be willing to go up in it? I have never met you, but I hear that you are a bright little monkey who can do all sorts of things, and that's just what we need. We want you to do something nobody has ever done before. Bail out of a spaceship in flight. When we flash you a signal, you will have to open the door and bail out with the help of emergency rockets. We hope that you are willing and that your friend will permit you to go. Gratefully yours, Professor Wiseman, Director of the Science Museum. And there they are, coming to his rescue, and there is the letter. "So you are George," said Professor Wiseman. "If I had only known. Of course you will be forgiven if you're willing to go." They got the smallest size spacesuit for George and all the other things he needed for the flight, and then they helped him put them on and showed him how to use everything. And when it was all ready, a truck drove down with a special television screen mounted on it to watch the flight. And here is a checklist for George, which I'll show you a picture of. Checklist. 1. Space suit, complete with shoes and gloves. 1 space helmet. 1 oxygen tank. 2 emergency rockets. 1 parachute. They all got on and were off to the launching site, and they checked all the controls on the spaceship, especially the lever that opened the door. George tried it too. So there they are. And there's the checklist. Let me make sure you can see everything. And there they go, George in his little spacesuit. And off they go. The great moment had come. George waved goodbye and went aboard, and the door was closed. Professor Wiseman began to count. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! And he pressed the button, and the ship rose in the air, slowly first, then faster and faster and higher, until he could no longer see it in the sky. but on the screen, they saw George clearly the whole time. There's George in there. And then there is George blasting off in a rocket. And nowadays, we see lots of rockets blast off. And if you look on other YouTube channels, you can see pictures of rockets blasting off. So we send them up a lot now. Now the moment had come for George to bail out. Professor Wiseman flashed the signal, and they watched the screen. George did not move. Why didn't he pull the lever? In a few seconds, it would be too late. The ship would be lost in outer space with George in it. They waited anxiously. They waited. And at last, George began to move, slowly, as if in a daze. He was groping for the lever. Would he reach it in time? There! He grabbed it. The door opened. Hooray! George was on his way. Out of the blue, and the open parachute came floating down to the earth, and the truck raced to the spot where George had landed. And there they are, waiting to see. There you go. And there's George floating down. What a welcome for George. Professor Wiseman hung a big gold medal around his neck because he said, "You're the first living being to come back to Earth from a space flight." And on the medal it said, "To George, the first space monkey." Then the newspapers took his picture and everybody shouted and cheered. The farmer and his son and the kind woman from next door who worked for hours to get the water out of the room. "I'm proud of you, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "I guess the whole world is proud of you today." It was the happiest day in George's life. There's little George who made it back. Everybody came to see him. The end. Oh, that story was written before we started sending a bunch of rockets up. So that's kind of fun. I thought you'd like that one. All right. Thank you for joining me. That's all for our story today. Be sure to let your parents know to like and subscribe. And if you have any comments that you want to talk to me about the story, or questions that you have, or information that you have, you can tell your parents and they can put it in the comments. And then if they set up their phone or their computer, when they subscribe, then they can click on the bell and that'll tell you every time I put a new video up. I enjoy getting this time with you. Bye-bye.